Hello, folks. Welcome to Humanity Now Podcast. Today we are going to be speaking about communism with Josh Morris. Josh is a professor of history at Grand Valley State University in Michigan, and he's the author of an upcoming book called The Many Worlds of American Communism. Hello, Josh. Welcome to Humanity Now Podcast. Thank you for coming.
Thank you for having me. Pleasure to be here.
Absolutely. Can you please tell the audience a bit about yourself?
Sure. I'm a professor, as you already said, I'm a professor of history at Grand Valley State University, visiting professor to be specific. And I'm originally from California, San Diego. I come from a Navy family, and I moved out to Michigan to get my PhD from Wayne State University. I got my undergraduate degree from the University of California, Santa Barbara, and it's there where I focused on history and Cold War studies that pretty much directed my focus into the labor movement as well as radical left history.
Awesome. Can you please tell the audience what politicized you? What made you interested in communism and other politics?
So I started off at UCSB as a film student. I was very much interested in film. However, my professors noted that I was much better at writing in history than I was at interpreting film. So I started shifting to studying history, and the only real history that I found interest in was the history that my father conveyed to me. He was a submariner in the U.S. Navy in the late 1970s and early 1980s, and I was always fascinated by his stories regarding the Cold War and spying on the Soviet Union. When I got to college, I didn't understand why we were spying on the Soviet Union if we weren't actually at war with them. So I started to study more about the Cold War. I attended the Center for Cold War Studies at UCSB, and it was there that I got exposed to radical left labor history in the United States, labor history in Europe, the political movements that push for revolution both in Europe and the United States. And I wouldn't want to say became convinced, but I learned to understand where the radical groups of both Europe and the United States were coming from, why they were making the demands that they were making. And I also noticed that there was a misperception on the part of the broader public, as well as the people that they were trying to convince and get demands conceded from about what the movement is about. So I just decided to further study it, unpack it more and more and more. And I eventually found that, the further and further that you dive down the rabbit hole of radical leftism, you either end up agreeing with a lot of the principles and understanding it from the perspective of leftists, or you end up contrasting your own experiences against that. And thus you kind of create a negative perspective of the labor movement overall. So I fall into the former category. The more and more that I read and learned about new leftist theory, the more that I came to understand why people were advocating these kinds of concepts and why their demands were being made.
That's great. Thank you. I want to start with the question, what is socialism and what is communism and what is the difference?
That's a very, very philosophical question, as my graduate professors would always try and tell me. So there's two ways of answering that question. The one way is how philosophy and theorists would define it. Socialism refers to the idea that workers have ownership of the productive system, meaning there isn't an owner of Tesla, or there isn't an owner of Twitter, etc., that it is owned by all the people who are using it, and it is owned by all the people who are maintaining it and keeping it alive. That's the broad, general philosophical definition of socialism. Communism, in the philosophical term, would refer to the stage after this, at which the need for things like government, civil society, property, etc., will have withered away because our relationship with one another has changed as a result of getting rid of owners and getting rid of company owners, people who are pulling the strings of the economy but are not actually on the ground doing the work. But again, this is very philosophical, very abstract, and you have to kind of put yourself into the world of Platonic idealism to imagine what type of a society this would be. And usually what you imagine ends up being a lot better sounding than what it actually ends up playing out. So that's where the second answer to that question comes from, which is, what is socialism and communism in the real world? What we've seen by groups like China, the Soviet Union, Vietnam, Korea, and numerous other states that have laid claim to a socialist economy and a socialist government is not necessarily the kind of socialism that we see talked about by political theorists and philosophers like Karl Marx and even Vladimir Lenin. The idea of socialism that we see in those countries, I would describe more accurately as state socialism or state capitalism, in which the government is a very powerful force in civil society, and it has a very direct purpose. Now, I find that somewhat contradictory to the philosophical idea of socialism, in which this whole state apparatus is supposed to wither away. In the Soviet Union, the state system proved so useful that the idea of it withering away was kind of unrealistic. They couldn't keep their society functioning if the state withered away. So that's the secondary answer to the question, is that in the real world, socialism and communism end up becoming distortions of the philosophical idea that they are based upon. I would argue that we've never seen communism in the real world, because by definition it implies that the state no longer exists, that property relations no longer exist, and that the family unit as a whole has also transformed. I don't see that occurring in the Soviet Union, in China today, etc. Maybe they're teetering between the phase of capitalism and socialism. Perhaps there's arguments to that. But they certainly haven't reached what the philosophers had detailed as a position in which workers have direct and absolute control over the productive system in their society.
Excellent, Josh. My next question is, how did socialism/communism start? Who started it?
As a philosophy or as like a movement in the real world?
I would say as a philosophy to start.
So as a philosophy, socialism is a pretty old concept. I mean, there are even theorists who argue that the Bible teaches concepts of socialism, and that antiquity teaches certain concepts of socialism. And in that sense, socialism just means the basic idea of equity and equality in society, in which everyone has an equal share of what's going on. So if we boil it down to that kind of simple concept, then the idea of socialism is present in Plato's Republic, in which he describes a society where it's propertyless. People do not require power or systems of power in order to survive. And the society is run by a group of super intellectual philosophical kings. That would be comparable to the idea of socialism in the modern sense. When did it get started in the contemporary period? You had in the early 19th century a group of German, French, and English writers come out and start propounding this idea of utopianism. The idea that we can create this ideal concept of society and hold existing society up to it, and then constantly try to make existing society relate better and better to this ideal. Saint Simon is a good example of utopian socialism. There are many other examples, but that's probably the best one to think about, Saint Simon. Karl Marx then comes onto the scene by the 1840s with a reassessment of how these utopian philosophers were thinking about it. And that boils down to this debate of the mind-body problem that I talked to you about privately in the Facebook chat. The mind-body problem boils down to idealism versus materialism. Plato's argument that things that are in your mind and things that are abstracted from the mind are more real than what's around us in the physical world. And then Aristotle's rejection of this and saying it doesn't matter if ideas come first and foremost for the human mind. What matters is that things have to play out on the real world. So utopian socialists like Saint Simon in the early 19th century are idealists in the sense that they argue that capitalism is immoral, they argue that it is unethical, and they argue that it is just socially wrong, and that it should be altered, it should be changed, and that there are a set of ideals to uphold for the new society. Karl Marx steps into this whole debate in the mid-19th century, the 1840s, and he publishes the Communist Manifesto in 1848, and basically says, you guys all have it wrong. You guys are thinking too abstractly about capitalism. Capitalism is not an immoral system. It is not an unethical system. And more importantly, it is not an illogical system. And Marx worked very hard to try and argue that the society that we live in is the product of a logical system evolving over time. So in that sense, he doesn't necessarily see capitalism as a religious wrong or something that started off on a good path, but then faulted and went into a bad path. He sees capitalism working precisely the way that it should, creating inequalities, maximizing wealth for a certain group of individuals, because that's not very different from how society functioned in the past. It's just a new form of that productivity. Thus, Marx rejects the utopian socialists and says, no, what we require is a scientific, logical understanding of capitalism in order to move forward. And that's where we get the phrase scientific socialism and historical materialism, in which we no longer argue that capitalism has some kind of inherent fault with it, but that it is functioning precisely as it is intended, and that is precisely why it should be overthrown. That inequality and capitalism cannot be separated, that you cannot fix the wrongdoings of a capitalist society, that it is the wrongdoings that people point out are part and parcel to the functioning of that system.
Excellent. Okay, so that leads me to my next question. What are some of the ideas and concepts of communism?
In the strict philosophical sense, it would be abolition of private property and the relations that uphold private property. So that includes concepts of the family in which the male is the head of the household or the breadwinner of the household. Think of it like this. I recently bought a home, so a lot of this is actually just somewhat still new to me. But when somebody buys a home today, let's say you have a partner. A lot of banks and a lot of advisors will tell you, if you buy a home, you should never buy a home jointly with someone else, because you don't know what's going to happen with your relationship in the future. You don't know what's going to happen with your life in the future, etc. So it should always be one person. Now, as logical as that sounds within the framework of, contemporary capitalism and being an adult in the 21st century, what it also pretty much says is that you have to accept a certain set of rules that once you live in that home, you, the breadwinner, are now solely responsible for this property. And everyone else who lives in that property with you is dependent upon you to maintain that property for survival. So let's say I decided I wanted to get rid of my home and I wanted to leave the state, but my partner or the other people who are dependent on me do not want to do so. Suddenly they are in a huge crisis in which they don't have property, they don't even have equity, and they don't have credit so that they can go find a place of their own. They are in many ways stuck with my situation. If I decide to move to another state, they either have to move with me or they end up homeless, or they have to downgrade where they're living. So that's a good example of how property relations control and constrain our overall day-to-day activities and the choices that we can make in our lives. Well, communism in the very strict sense would be a direct abolishment of this arrangement, in which if someone were living under me and they were dependent on me for survival, my choices in life would not necessarily negatively impact theirs, that there would be some sort of social safety net around to help them out if my choices in life conflict with theirs. So that's one example. And I'm trying to be as, I guess, contextual and straightforward with my examples as possible. I don't want to be too abstract and philosophical about it. But in general, the abolishment of private property is the first and foremost goal of communist theory. The secondary goal would be the reappropriation of the quote unquote means of productivity into the hands of the workers. Now, what Marx and communists mean when they say that is not necessarily like we're going to take the factory away from the owner and then just give it over to the workers so that they own everything and now they're all making the profits. It's more about this concept called industrial democracy, in which you take the principles of democracy and the principles of a republic and extract them out of the political realm and put them into the workplace. So rather than have a CEO and rather than have a board oversee productivity and ensure that productivity is maximized and cost is minimized, you hand the decision-making process over to the workers. So the workers then get to democratically decide how much they're being paid, how many hours they're going to work, what conditions of their workplace are, if they need to upgrade their workplace, if they need newer things like a new bathroom or if they need a new workroom, etc. Removing the choice from the business owners who don't do much of the labor involved in the overall production process and hand that decision-making power over to the people who are physically making all the working. This doesn't necessarily mean that the CEOs and the business individuals are useless. Their investment and their continued investment in the business is what keeps it alive. But industrial democracy, by handing the power over to the mass people working in a factory system, they can then decide how much of that money is needed, how much of it is not needed, and whether or not that money should be appropriated for fixing, upgrading, or in some ways bettering the workplace.
Very good, very good. So those are the two main concepts of communism. Let's go back and talk about scientific socialism for a minute. Can you explain more about that?
So scientific socialism is a phrase that Marx's friend and financier Frederick Engels came up with, and he used the term to contrast what Marx's system was against all those utopians. So the use of the word scientific is supposed to specifically kind of be a jab at the utopian socialists, saying that you guys are abstract, you guys have your heads in the clouds, you guys are unrealistic, and you're hopelessly idealistic. And by calling themselves scientific, Frederick Engels is appealing to, what is it called? The empiricist movement of the early 19th century, in which scientists were demanding that their school of thought be considered differently than the school of philosophy. And so using that word scientific socialism is kind of a way to say, like, our socialism is better than your socialism. Ours is more rational, it's more logical, and it's based on empirical evidence, while yours is just a bunch of abstract theories about how capitalism is bad.
Awesome. Okay. What is historical materialism?
So historical materialism it's kind of a term that's interchangeable with scientific socialism. We use historical materialism in academia today to refer to Marx's system overall. So in that sense, it's definitely compatible with scientific socialism as a term. Marx himself, I do not think ever actually used the phrase. He did emphasize the quote unquote materialist conception of history. But the phrase historical materialism or dialectical materialism, I don't think Marx actually used that phrase. Even the word dialectical materialism came from a man named Joseph Dietzken, who was a tanner in Germany. And his son, Eugene Dietzken, created a big drafting corporation of the United States that's still around today. But anyway, I'm getting off topic. Historical materialism in the philosophical sense refers to the idea that history is a forward-moving process, that it is not random and it is not chaotic as some religious systems depict it and as some other philosophies of history depict it. The best way of thinking about it came from an advisor of mine and someone that I never met, but I read a lot of his books, John Somerville. And he said, if you think about history like paper, here's the easy way to understand historical materialism. If you were to take, according to traditional Aristotelian logic, if you were to take paper and you just hold it in your hand, it has three basic laws to it. A equals A, the paper is paper. A does not equal B, paper is not paper. Like, this is not a brick. This is not a car. This is paper. Those are the two laws of Aristotelian logic. The third one is the law of non-contradiction. The paper can only be paper, or it can not be paper. It cannot be both at the same time. So Marx said, Marx, came up with the concept, but John Somerville said, now let's take this paper and isolate it in a box for 150,000 years. Immediately after we open that box, Aristotle's entire logical system is going to be thrown into question. For example, you might notice that the paper has ceased to be paper. It no longer is paper. You can't write on it. The second that you try to write on it, it just crumbles. It turns into dust. So the utility of the paper is what makes it paper. If I can't write on it, use it as paper, then it's not actually paper in that sense. So Somerville then says, well, at what point did the paper cease to be paper? How would we ever break that down and figure that out? And he'd say the answer is you can't really figure that out, because the paper is changing constantly over time. And we know because of quantum physics that it is changing at a chemical level, at the molecular level. Every single second it is decaying and transforming into something else. So Somerville comes up with a new law for Aristotle and says it's not that A is always A and A is never B. The answer is that A is always becoming B. A is constantly becoming something else. Moreover, if we were to ask where on the paper is the change occurring, it's not occurring at any one point. The change is occurring all over the paper, on every single molecule that makes up this shred of paper. Now, as such, the paper is always changing. In other words, the change is the paper. That's what Somerville's argument about dialectical materialism is that history, just like the paper, is always changing. It is never static. It is never unmoving. It is constantly becoming something else. That is what the philosophy of historical materialism asserts about history, which is a very powerful assertion in contradiction to previous ideas in which they view periods of history as static. And then the moments of revolutionary change, those are these chaotic revolutionary periods that it's difficult to understand politically and economically. In reality, Somerville says, no, that's just when the pot boils over. The pot is boiling the entire time. But eventually it gets to a point where the change just has to overthrow the system and cause massive social and civic changes. So that would be my answer to what is historical materialism.
That is excellent, Josh. I really appreciate that. That's all the questions that I have right now. Is there more that you could say about communism within our conversation right now?
Well, especially for people who are just learning about the subject, it's important to know that communism, just like any other topic that you can find with regard to politics or economics, has multiple sides to it. Communists disagree with each other, Marxists disagree with each other, socialists disagree with Marxists, et cetera, et cetera. So if you're new to studying this sort of stuff, don't fall into the trap of thinking that communism and new leftist theory is, kind of one big monolith. It's in many ways not. It's just as divisive as you will find political groups like Democrats and Republicans. They just disagree over different things. So my advice would be to read as much as you can and be open-minded about the things that you read.
Excellent. Okay, well, we'll stop there for today because I want to continue this as a series about communism, and we can branch off into like more the less philosophical and more of the history, the actual history of socialism and communism and how it's played out in the world. And then we're going to talk about your book, and we're going to talk about the socialist movements in America, and it's going to be great. But I really, really appreciate your time today, and you've just been fantastic.
Well, I'm happy to be here. Always happy to help out.
Thank you. All right. Have a great day.
You too. Bye.
Yeah. Bye.